Hey everybody, it's Brian here. Welcome to Sunday morning. I hope you woke up nicely, got your breakfast and cups of coffee in you. Happy quarantine. I hope you've been able to find some inner peace during this time of isolation. This morning we're going to be starting off with Death Was Arrested. So I invite you all, wherever you are, if you're in your living rooms, wherever, to stand with us all this morning and worship.
Sorrow and dead my sin, lost without hope and no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began, ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. My orphan heart was given a name. My mourning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from my chain, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and he called me his friend. Oh, that's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free have made us new. Now life begins with you. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the redeemed. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested and my life began. When death was arrested and my life began. That's when death was arrested and my life began.
Hello and welcome to the Belong Collective.
Thank you for joining us on this digital gathering. You can follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and on our website.
If you want to support the Belong Collective, you can go to our website.
Thank you for being with us this Sunday. I hope that you have a great Sunday today.
God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice. The earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. He says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress."
There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus. To break every chain, to break every chain, to break every chain. There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus. To break every chain, to break every chain, to break every chain. To break every chain, to break every chain, to break every chain. All sufficient sacrifice. there's an army rising up. Oh, 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 there's an army rising up to break every chain, 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 to break every chain. There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus. There is power in the name of Jesus to break every chain, to break every chain, to break every chain.
Well, hello, good morning, happy Sunday morning to you. We are back again in our series on the book of Joseph. It was all a dream, the story of Joseph. Last week when we were in this series, we looked at the character of Joseph, kind of the unveiling of his character, and what we learned is that Jacob is his father, and his father has 13 kids to 4 women, and it's very interesting family dynamics. And yes, the story is in the Bible. It's a very interesting story. And there's all this envy and jealousy amongst the brothers. And the envy and jealousy is mainly there because Joseph, the youngest, who is not supposed to be the most privileged, is not supposed to be the one that gets the blessing, has the blessing of his father. So much so that he's made him like this special coat and like this coat of many colors, which kind of signifies his blessing. He's constantly, favoring Joseph. Even Joseph gets to go out and kind of bring back a report on how his brothers are doing in the field. So he kind of is this like supervisor in even some ways of his brothers. That is, he goes out and brings back a report to his father. And we even saw last week that he brought back a bad report on his brothers, like how they were doing, kind of almost like you could say tattletale. I mean, his dad put him in that position. It's a very complicated reality, like family dynamic that Joseph finds himself in as a 17-year-old growing up in this family of multiple half brothers, trying to figure out how to make do. And so he has all these dreams as well. And these dreams are telling him that like one day he's going to be in charge and that everyone's going to bow down to him. And then he shares these dreams with his brothers, and that only widens the gap further, as you can imagine, because giving them one more thing to be envious of and jealous of as their brother continues to have privilege over them. And now Joseph is sent again to check in on his brothers. We're still in Genesis 37, and he's sent again to bring back a report. And so last week we reread he brought a report back and it was bad, and now he's sent out again to bring a report back, and he goes quite a ways to check in on his brothers. And here's where we pick up the story. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." Envy and jealousy always lead to bad outcomes. We said that last week, and now we're starting to see the reality of that in Joseph's story. This envy and jealousy that has taken root in his brothers, and ultimately they have not worked through or worked on or tried to change the reality of their hearts, has now led them to seeing their brother coming to check in on them again, likely maybe even going to bring a bad report back to his father about them. And they are like, let's kill him. They hated him. We learned that last week. And now they're actually making a plan to kill their brother while they see him approaching far off. And the story continues. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, one of the brothers, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So Reuben seems to at least be thinking of his father in this situation. We're not sure if he's thinking of Joseph. Maybe he's really honestly concerned for Joseph's well-being as his half-brother, but it seems as if he's actually concerned about his father's well-being. At least we can probably deduce that he's concerned about what this will likely do to his father, that this reality of Joseph dying will break his father's heart. And so he's concerned about that. And maybe there's some real just real emotions of like, we don't want to kill our brother, do we? Like maybe his heart isn't as envious and jealous, but also maybe he's using this as a positional thing too. It could be that he's positioning himself to be the brother who rescued Joseph and to climb up the ladder, if you will, to tell his father, hey, they were trying to kill him, but I rescued him. I don't know. Ultimately, the family dynamics here are such that we don't really know Reuben's heart in all this, but ultimately it goes from death to, hey, I think I'm going to throw a different plan in the works here and then come back and rescue my brother for whatever reason I might have to do that. And here's how the story goes. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Remember the coat of many colors? Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother. He's our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites who were Midianite traders came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. Sometime later, Reuben returned. So really quick point here. Reuben is gone for this interaction. So the one who's there to protect Joseph seems to be gone. So it's not all the brothers that are doing this. There's, at the very least, we know Reuben is not here for this particular part. So sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. Then he went back to his brothers and lamented, "The boy is gone. What will I do now?" Then the brothers killed a young goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They sent this beautiful robe to their father with the message, "Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?" Their father recognized it immediately. "Yes," he said, "it is my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "I will go to my grave mourning for my son," he would say, and then he would weep. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. What a wild story. So ultimately, here's some things that we've seen from this story, like the synopsis, if you will. The synopsis is Joseph comes up on the brothers. The brothers plan to kill him in a pretty brutal way. And then they're like, well, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in the cistern and he'll just die eventually. And then they see the opportunity to make some money and also maybe relieve themselves of some guilt of killing someone, their brother especially. And so they decide to make a little money and also relieve themselves of this guilt. And ultimately, Reuben in the whole thing is trying to save his brother, trying to work on his behalf, but doesn't get the chance to do so, whether he's working on his brother's behalf or just to try to position himself with his father. Or maybe he knows that this is something that's going to deeply break his father, which later on we see it does deeply break his father. Like his father is in legitimate mourning on a whole new level. Like he's like, I'm going to go to my grave mourning the loss of Joseph. And in all of this, Joseph is sent to Egypt as a slave now. That story escalated quickly. Like in one chapter, we see all of this tension build and ultimately explode for Joseph. Envy and jealousy always lead to bad outcomes. We talked about this last week. It's true this week as well. But I want us to take a moment to just imagine being Joseph. Like maybe you are 17 years old and you're watching this, or maybe you can remember back to 17, or maybe you can think forward to 17. I don't know where you're at, but think about being a young person and relying largely on your family and largely on your relationship with your father. And now you found yourself completely alone. How painful is this moment for Joseph? Like really think about that. How unprepared is he for this? He seems to be quite immature, at the very least relationally immature, because he's almost constantly taunting his brothers, whether he's doing that intentionally or just because of the positional authority that he's been given as the blessed younger brother. He doesn't seem to know that like this isn't going well for you to keep telling them about these dreams that you have that you're going to rule over them. He just keeps kind of telling them what's happening. But ultimately right now, he must be so scared and fearful of what's going to happen. He's never been in this situation before. His entire life has been laid out for him. He is the blessed one. Ultimately, his position is based on his father's position, and he's going to be okay. Nothing in his life is unsecure as far as he's concerned. It's all pretty secured for the future. At this moment, though, he's now a slave to someone else. He hasn't been a slave. He's been privileged and positioned his entire life. Now he's entering into some of the deepest suffering he's probably ever experienced. Actually, quite honestly, definitely ever experienced. And I just want to say this about suffering, because for many of us, we might even be experiencing suffering right now in this moment. Whether that's suffering on the level of Joseph's suffering, where it's like everything is out of control. Everything is just completely different than ever before. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond. I'm afraid. Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe not. But here's what I want to say first. We are not always responsible for our suffering. This is really important. We're not always responsible for our suffering. For some of us, we might feel a certain sense of responsibility for our suffering. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes we make decisions that bring about our suffering. And sometimes suffering happens to us at the hands of others, and it's ultimately out of our control. And then sometimes it's a mixture of both. And I would actually say in this situation, you can argue it's a mixture of both. In some ways, Joseph has brought this upon himself, but there's also an argument to be made that Joseph is not responsible for this. Like this is a family dynamic that he was thrust into as a young child. And how's he expected to navigate the complexity of these relationships in this reality? Ultimately, let's put it this way. Joseph is not fully responsible for the situation he's found himself in. He's found himself in some serious suffering as now being a slave and ultimately having no position of authority, going from the position of great authority to no authority. He's in a deep suffering space. We are not always responsible for our suffering. And sometimes we beat ourselves up as we're going through suffering, believing that we are responsible for the place that we found ourselves in. It is important to own the places where we are responsible, own our mistakes, acknowledge them, speak them. I made a mistake, and ultimately I'm suffering the consequences of that mistake. But it's also important to recognize where suffering happens in our world And it's not always something that's easily explained. Or maybe we don't always understand the other relational dynamics that are happening that led to our suffering. Or maybe we don't even understand the decisions that other people made that hurt us and the position that they were in while they made those decisions that hurt us. Now, this isn't to say that those people aren't responsible for their actions. It's simply to say, as we process our suffering, it's important that we don't thrust on ourselves all the responsibility every single time, because there are certain times where things are just going to happen. Suffering can be part of life, and ultimately, it is part of life. Here, though, is the important thing. We are always responsible for our response to suffering. This is really important. We're not always responsible for the circumstances we find ourselves in of suffering, but we are always responsible for our response to suffering. Like a saying that I really enjoy is, if you cannot change your circumstance, change your perspective. If you cannot change your circumstance, change your perspective. So imagine you're going through really deep suffering. Like, you might not be able to change that. That's probably a reality you're going to experience. There's a lot of suffering happening in this story. Think of it from Jacob's perspective, the father. He can't change his circumstance. He believes his son is dead. Can he change his perspective? Yes. Can he be responsible for how he journeys through that suffering? Yes. We have a responsibility in that way. We have the power to change our perspective. And look, that does not mean it's easy. That does not mean suffering is this thing where we just paint a happy brush over all the suffering we experience because ultimately we can just change our perspective. No, it's probably going to be a process, an incredibly painful process for many of us as we go through deep suffering. But here's the deal. That is what we're in control of. We are in control of how we approach our suffering and the perspective we hold in the midst of it. And one of the perspectives I like to hold to when I'm going through suffering or when I'm going through difficult times, and it's something that even I'm wearing around my neck right now, is a saying. And the saying goes, "A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor." A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. As we go through suffering, we should also consider, what are these rough waters that I'm going through potentially going to build in me? What might I learn about myself, about the world, about others as I go through this? And as we think about Joseph's situation, in some ways, you can consider him lucky. Now, I want to be careful here because being sold into slavery is not a good position to be in, and I don't in any way want to have rose-colored lenses towards your pain or your suffering. I don't know what you're going through, but initially his brothers were going to kill him. It went from death to slavery. No, slavery is not good, but it's better than death. How do we find the perspective that allows us to acknowledge that there may be something in our particular reality that we can still be thankful for? There's very little that Joseph has to be thankful for. Let's just be honest. Let's just be clear. He's been sold into slavery. There's very little in the midst of this suffering to remain positive about or thankful about. But he's not dead. And his brothers initially wanted to kill him. That was where this was going. And he probably knew that because remember, he was hanging out in that cistern before this caravan ever approached. And ultimately, they probably told him they were going to leave him there for dead. He probably knew, at the very least, that this is not going to end well. And now he kind of gets the second chance, even though it's going to be a painful road. It's going to be a lot of suffering. So how do we change our perspective amidst our pain? I think that's really important. And that begins with trying to find what we have to remain thankful for. Is there anything in our life that we can be grateful for, thankful for, that we can give thanks to God for, even in our deepest moments of pain? And that is ultimately going to bring us some sense of hope, some sense of joy, something to hold on to amidst those deep, deep valleys that we might find ourselves in. Finally, and here's what I think Joseph does in this story. Hold on to the hope that God is able to bring good out of even the worst suffering. Hold on to the hope that God is able to bring something good even out of the worst suffering. See, Joseph is in this position, but ultimately God is about to bring about something really good for Joseph. He doesn't see it coming. There's a lot of roads along the way that he's going to take as we continue to see this story. But ultimately, the story continues and progresses, and God is going to repurpose all of this pain, all of this suffering for good. Joseph is learning and experiencing things along the way that are going to prepare him for the position that he's ultimately going to have. See, his suffering is not the road you would have paved for how to get to where his destination ends up being, like his destiny, if you will, the reality of what these dreams that he's been having are revealing to him and his purpose. But he'll get there. It's going to be a lot of detours. It's going to be God repurposing difficult circumstances that he continues to experience for good. So, do we believe in a God who can repurpose difficult circumstances for good? Whether we're responsible solely for those circumstances or whether those circumstances have happened completely out of our control. Do you believe that God can take the failure that you had, the sin, the brokenness that you experienced, and that you're fully responsible for, and do something good with it, lead you to the next mile marker in your journey, and it's actually a good outcome? For some of us, we've believed the lie that we're useless, we're broken, we're damaged goods that ultimately can't be restored because of the decision we made back here and ultimately the realities and the outcomes of that decision. But this story reminds us that God can create something good in any story. God can redeem and restore any suffering. And he's doing that already in the story of Joseph by saving him from death. But we're going to see him continue to work for Joseph's good. And so wherever you're at, whether you're experiencing the pain that you've kind of brought upon yourself by decisions you've made, or whether you're experiencing the pain of others, or maybe you're experiencing this collective pain that we're all in of being in the shelter-in-place reality and the reality of this virus. And maybe it's touched you in all different kinds of ways. It could just be that this is really hard to stay at home for this amount of time and to miss my friends and to not have hugs anymore and events anymore. Or maybe you've had financial suffering through this, or maybe you've had the suffering of having to mourn the loss of someone that you love to this reality. And so wherever we're suffering, we need to know that God can bring about restoration in this. Now, ultimately, we look toward eternity and the restoration of that. But what's beautiful about this story is that restoration is possible in the here and now. That our stories are not finished. Are you breathing? Then your story is not finished. There is still more to be written. And yes, this chapter that we just finished or that we're in the middle of may be completely off the rails. You may feel like you are chained up, shackled, and headed into slavery. But the truth of it is there's another chapter opening up. And so will we have the faith to believe that God can bring about something good in the future chapters of our story? This is what Joseph's story reminds us, is that God is good and God's goodness is for us. God is not against us. God is desiring to bring about something good in your story. May you believe it. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, be with us as we suffer. One of the beautiful things about going through suffering is that we know we serve a God who suffers right alongside of us. In our pain, you are there with us. You are not absent us. And so we thank you for that. And God, as we journey through pain, may you continue to shape our perspective. May you continue to remind us of all the things we have to be thankful and grateful for. And may that fuel our perspective, that we would never become so focused on our suffering that we would forget all the things we have to be grateful for. And God, may our hope rest in you. and your ability to renew and restore and reclaim any story, any suffering. God, the book is not over in our story. Like the end has not been spoken over our story. Remind us of that. Some of us need hope right now because we're feeling hopeless. Remind us of all the ways you're going to take this moment of suffering and ultimately reclaim it for something good. And that it's just a detour in our journey. It is not a roadblock. It is not the end. It's just a detour. Ultimately, you can build something new from this. Remind us of that. When we become hopeless, God, may your Spirit and your presence restore hope in our story. In the name of Jesus, amen.
And I came to walking on the train tracks. How did I get here? And how do I get back? I've been up all night, let's stay awake. Push it further, you know I'll never break. At some point in the party, I thought my heart was failing. You said, hey, you're okay, you seem to be still standing. Flashes appeared at the corner of my eyes. I saw the stars and I didn't ask why. I heard the voices and caught my breath. So close and yet so far from death. So close and yet so far from death. So close and yet so far from death. Well, the feeling was always too much for me. It always came too strong. I wanted to get it right so badly that I always got it wrong. So you keep pushing on. You hope it won't be long till you find the child you were and find a way to get along. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. And oh, my little sister, when the drugs are wearing off, I climbed into your bed and said, I think I did too much. In some ways that was simpler, being too messed up to see. I didn't have to wake up to the world that always was around me. And now we are awake, and it seems too much to take. I wanna close my eyes because I fear my heart will break. I want to look away, I want to look away, I want to look away. I must not look away. And don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love. Don't go blindly into the dark, and every one of us shines a light of love.
All right, everybody, that concludes the worship for today. I hope you had an amazing Sunday, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your week. Remember that you are light. Do not go blindly into the dark. I love you all.
Goodbye, friends from New Blonde Collective. See you next week.